Zoro vs Ryuma is a fight that has been erased from history, much like how God Valley was erased by the world government, or like how Zoro selectively erased Kokoro from his own memory. Because this event was the God Valley of swordsmen, something that could not be allowed to reach the ears, the hearts, or the loins of the outside world. Because what happened here was the death and resurrection of the body and spirit of the greatest samurai to have ever lived. This is one of those fights that goes very underappreciated by readers and watchers of One Piece, because it's not the same old stuff that Oda usually explores. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of details to be missed, which can actually change your entire perspective on what happened here. And it should be said that one of those missing details is that this fight requires homework, as Ryuma is a character who predates Zoro both in-world as his ancestor and in the real world, as Eiichiro Oda created the character of Ryuma before Zoro. This was for one of Oda's many pre-One Piece one-shots called Monsters, and in this one-shot, Ryuma is presented as something of a mix of Zoro and Luffy. Zoro's pride, honor, and dedication to the sword, combined with Luffy's wackiness, food-driven obsession, and nose-picking habits. And in this one-shot, Ryuma killed a dragon, saved a bunch of people, and this became canon One Piece world history. As in the One Piece manga, his full name was revealed to be Shimotsuki Ryuma, making Zoro his direct descendant. However, the Ryuma that we're concerned with here isn't exactly the same one. On Thriller Bark, we meet Zombie Ryuma, which is Ryuma's corpse stolen by Gecko Moria and reanimated by shoving Brook's shadow into it, which gives us a lovely Ryuma shell commanded by a Brookish personality, which is why the very first thing that Zombie Ryuma does after his full introduction is ask to see Nami's panties. There is a lot of this happening on Thriller Bark. There is a sub-theme of identity which is played out very well in many of the zombies, another great example of which is Victoria's Sindri, but also Luffy's shadow being inserted into Orz's corpse and how this new Luffy hybrid decides to act. But with Ryuma, we explore the very core issue of what it is to be a swordsman, which, especially on Wano, is a lifelong pursuit that one dedicates their soul to, which is very much at odds with what's happening here, because you now have a foreign soul in control with Brook's shadow in Ryuma's body, and so this new Ryuma is unable to understand the meaning behind Brook's fighting style, and Brook's shadow is not able to understand the meaning of being a swordsman that the prior owner of this body dedicated their life to. So we call this fight Zoro versus Ryuma, but it's more like Ryuma versus Ryuma with like a little sprinkling of Brook flavor on top. It's quite an inner struggle, and it doesn't get anywhere near the attention it should, as this fight was the inception point of the story of Bartholomew Kuma, a man who was also present on Thriller Bark, and one who is currently fighting a similar identity crisis to Ryuma, as in theory he is effectively a shell body that is still somehow fighting for the principles of its previous inhabitant. Let's not skip over Zoro entirely though. Weirdly enough, he actually finds himself playing as role model for the Ryuma, this zombie Ryuma. Zoro displays the qualities and spirit of a swordsman to the body of the most legendary swordsman to have ever lived. So it is a very fun and unique character moment. Although very uncharacteristically, Zoro is the first one to leave the crew once he hears about Brook's history and why he's going to fight Ryuma. This is fascinating because usually Luffy is the first person to take action and lead the charge, but on this case during Thriller Bark, Zoro hops off the Thousand Sunny and says, "We're heading back in. Now we've got another shadow to retrieve, right?" And there's a couple of things going on here. Firstly, we have Brook fighting for his dream, which is to go and see his whale friend, and as a swordsman, Zoro respects that ambition, as well as the idea that sure, their dream may not be the same, but their pursuit is in concert. Secondly, Zoro doesn't admit this until after the fight, but he is actually also fighting for Ryuma. As someone who lives rather piously and drunkenly by the swordsman's code, Zoro knows that whatever Ryuma has become is now the antithesis of what his life would have wanted. And thirdly, because this is a challenge that Zoro cannot possibly ignore, and it is a great step towards eventually reaching Mihawk. To test your skills against history's greatest samurai, and Zoro even says, "So you're that legendary samurai who slew a dragon in ancient times. I don't even know if I believe dragons really existed, but I've wanted to meet you." Which is fun, because in saying that, Zoro has gone on to fight 2 very real dragons and 1 conjured dragon by King, and maybe some others that I'm forgetting about. There's a lot of dragons. There was a point in One Piece where dragons suddenly became frighteningly common. But again, very, very unusually for a Straw Hat fight, this whole conflict between Zoro and Ryuma is mostly all about Ryuma, as well as the greater theme of what it means to be a swordsman. And you would think that Ryuma, the most legendary sword man to have ever lived, would be the hill that Zoro has to climb, but no, it is the other way around. Due to his zombification, it is actually Ryuma that needs to undergo a journey to discover what it means to be a samurai samurai all over again. And a very integral piece of this actually takes place during Brook's fight against Ryuma. Whilst Ryuma is gloating about his assorted cut powers, he states, "Which part shall I cut off first using my special notch slash?" Emphasis on the word my there, as Brook responds with, "You don't know anything about that move, so don't use that name. I used to serve in my kingdom's raider squad. The quick draw attack at which I was most skilled was Requiem Le Banderole. My comrades in arms renamed it with regard to my sword fighting technique, 3-pace hum notch slash. You may have my personality and skills, but you've forgotten all the memories and humanity." So we have Ryuma using Brook's techniques, but there's no weight behind them. And that is a pretty big deal for a swordsman, because their techniques aren't just a simple mastery of muscle memory. They carry deep personal meaning and come infused with the desires and ambition of their users, which is a callback to chapter 84, which, and this is insane, is titled Zombie, which I believe was referring to Zoro's post-Mihawk corpse still being up and moving. But I love that Zoro is now fighting an actual zombie, and we're referencing this chapter. But this is where Hachan berates Zoro for being mathematically superior. His 6 swords can beat the 1 sword or even a 3 sword. As long as you don't have 7, Hachan's gonna win. And it's at this point that Zoro displays the true qualities of a swordman, which has much less to do with the sharp metal itself and how it's being used, but being a swordsman is all about why you're using them. And Zoro goes on to state that his swords are far weightier than Hachan's, because his blades carry not just his dream, but also Kuina's dream, and at this point, even Luffy's dream. So Hachan may have numerical superiority, his swords may be made out of a heavier material, and he hasn't come into this fight pre-cut by Mihawk, but to a true swordsman, all of those factors are irrelevant to begin with. And this is the big problem that Ryuma comes into this fight needing to solve. Ryuma may use Shusui, a black blade, one of the greatest sharp metals in the world, but it may as well be a cardboard cutout, because it lacks the weight of the feelings of the original Ryuma. And similarly, Ryuma may use Brook's fighting style to an even technically higher level than Brook, but at the same time it is hollow and fragile because zombie Ryuma doesn't understand the meaning behind any of those techniques or why Brook uses them. He's just spamming moves, and the physical superiority of his body has meant that this has worked for Ryuma so far, but that won't be the case in a fight against a fellow swordsman. In his fight against Ryuma, Zoro carries the weight of not just Luffy's, Kuina's, and his own dream, but he now has extra weight behind his swords as he comes into this conflict now carrying Brook's dream as well. Something that he does very much care about, despite telling Brook to quote, "shut up," and claim that his motivation was all about acquiring Shusui. So it should be said that when it comes to being a samurai, there are 7 principles that comprise Bushido: righteousness, loyalty, honor, respect, honesty, courage, and consistency, none of which were being practiced by zombie Ryuma prior to encountering Zoro, with the maybe argument of loyalty, but that's only because magical fruit powers were forcing Ryuma to be loyal to Moria. But he had betrayed the loyalties held both by the previous owner of this body and by the previous body of the Shadow. And more so than that, serving Gecko Moria of all people is extremely relevant to this discussion, as Moria himself is a man who embodies the exact opposite traits of a samurai. And look, dude embodies even more than that apparently, because just look at the size of that body that he never uses. But in very classic One Piece style, this is almost a battle of liberation, of rebelling against Gecko Moria's twisted control and for Ryuma to regain his sense of self. And what ensues from this is the most samurai fight that we will ever see in One Piece. What's notable is that much like against Hachan in the chapter titled Zombie, Zoro is fighting this zombie without a full complement of swords. Against Hachan, all he had was the Wado and eventually Johnny and Yosaku swords, and against Ryuma, he only has the Wado and the Sandai Kitetsu, as Yubashiri was destroyed on Enisobi, which means that at no point does Zoro have access to 3-sword style. He has to conduct this whole fight with a very traditional 1 or 2 sword arsenal, which is even commented on by Ryuma. He stated that using 3 swords sounded like a circus act. So this is a very clever setup by Oda in order to ensure that this encounter takes place on the terms of a traditional samurai, which works aesthetically as well as to remind what's left of Ryuma of what he once was, which starts fairly immediately. In fact, even just looking at the prospect of facing Zoro, Ryuma states, "It seems a feeling that I've long forgotten is beginning to rise up again within me. It's as if I'm about to fight a giant beast. This is a strange yet exciting feeling. My body wishes to dance." These are not the words of the personality that was inserted into Ryuma Ryuma's body, which was sourced from Brook. These are the feelings of Ryuma's body manifesting into desire, which is insane to think about, but of course, as I mentioned before, definitely not unprecedented in the series, as this is something that we've explored quite recently in One Piece, a question of what it is that constitutes life and where does it come from. With Bartholomew Kuma, there was an attempt to erase that life. He had both his memories and his free will taken away, and yet his body was still capable of acting on its own, with Zombie Ryuma being in an extremely similar position. The memories of the body's previous owner were removed, and his free will was taken away by being forced into Gecko Moria's servitude. And yet, in this duel against Zoro, the long-departed will of Ryuma is objectively somehow present within the body. And again, this fight is unusual for One Piece in almost every way. And another one of those aforementioned ways are because this fight actually begins at the end. We see Zoro falling from the roof, seemingly defeated, and with Ryuma standing seemingly victoriously before cutting back in time to 5 minutes ago, because that is exactly how long this fight lasted, 5 minutes on the dot, which is rather short by in-world One Piece standards, and that's on purpose because a duel between samurai tends not to extend into a battle of attrition. It starts and it's over like that. And the way that Oda handles this fake out is also quite reminiscent of all samurai media. You know, you've got that typical scene where there are two dueling swordsmen in the forest who each strike each other so quickly that you have no idea which of them got hit. Then there's like a little gust of wind, and then after a couple of tense seconds, one stumbles to the ground and you think it is they who have been defeated. But actually it was the other guy whose chest explodes with a gushing wound and he falls to the ground very dead. That sort of fake out is what's happening here with Zoro. It is intended that we believe that he lost, and then the situation is recontextualized. In terms of page count, this fight is more or less a chapter and a half. It's pretty crazy quick, but during these few precious pages and few minutes of in-world time, Ryuma rediscovers and liberates himself. Ryuma actually gets more powerful during this incredibly short fight, performing techniques that far surpass not just Brook's ability, but anything that Ryuma was capable of performing previously. And it's because as this fight goes on, more and more weight is added to Shusui. The will and desire of the original Ryuma still lingering in that corpse gets more and more activated, and it gets to the point where aside from the attack patterns, there is no noticeable trace of Brook anywhere within Ryuma. And Brook stares on at the fight, even though he has no eyes, in complete awe. He doesn't recognize himself, and it's because he's no longer really part of this equation. And it gets to the point where Zoro notices this, and he states, "My sword might break if this fight goes on. The body and mind of that legendary swordsman lives on in him," which is a line that I love, the idea that the mind is resurfacing. And also something goes a little bit unappreciated about this fight is just how equal Zoro and Ryuma were. I think this tends to be seen as a flawless victory for Zoro because he doesn't get hit even once. But just one mistake made by Zoro, and this very easily could have gone in the other direction. That is the level of precision that was on display during this fight. Whoever struck first was always going to decide everything in very typical samurai style. And so it was all about positioning and planning, which gave us the spectacle of the two of them dueling on the almost completely vertical pyramid roof. But of course, it's also about instinct and whoever carried the most weight behind their swords, which Ryuma was pretty rapidly catching up on towards the end there. So we'll get to the attack that Zoro ultimately used to win in a bit, because it's a little bit heartbreaking when you think about it. But here is why Ryuma lost this fight. The final attack used by Ryuma in this duel was Notch Slash, which is the attack that he didn't even know the meaning behind because he completely lacked the memories and therefore weight of Brook's life that went into creating it. He chose an attack with no weight behind it, and that may be the great tragedy of Ryuma, because I'm really not sure what else he could have done. Everything he knew about technical swordplay came from Brook, so all of his attacks were always going to be to some degree hollow. But this one attack, this one that we had lingered on, this one that Brook had berated him over, this is the one that he chose. And Zoro chose to counter with a new attack, one sword style Flying Dragon. And if you want to talk about weight, then mate, this attack is morbidly obese. Here Zoro has used his sword to conjure a blue fire dragon, which is a fantastic, albeit bittersweet bookend to the legacy of Ryuma. A man best known by history for slaying a dragon has now been slain by a dragon himself. But what's much more important is the blue fire. Neither of those elements were chosen just for the sake of it. Zoro set Ryuma's body aflame deliberately because samurai followed a practice of cremation. That wasn't originally common in Japan, but since samurai were these noble-born figures, they did indulge in that ritual. And so So here Zoro is laying Ryuma's body to rest in the traditional manner, and as for why the fire is blue, it's because in Japanese folklore there's a funky blue flame yokai called an onibi, which are souls leaving the body. So here Zoro is liberating both Ryuma's body and soul at the same time. But before Ryuma departs, two important things happen. Firstly, he displays the utmost respect for Zoro and graces him with Shusui, the famous blade of the legendary samurai Shusui. With you as its master, this blade will surely be satisfied. And then Ryuma laments on his defeat. It is unfortunate that the body of this samurai must suffer defeat, to which Zoro responds, as long as you feel shame, that's enough. A true swordsman in mind and body. I wish I could have seen you in your prime. And again, what Ryuma is saying here, these are not the words of Brook Shadow. This is Ryuma, and look, as wanky as it sounds, in death he has been resurrected, albeit briefly. This is not the exact same Ryuma that once slew a dragon and became Wano's most legendary figure, but it is the essence of Ryuma. That essence, for one brief moment, did return to this world once more, and I love that in an arc full of zombies and weird, wacky ways of bringing the dead kind of back to life, that this is the only case where I think you can argue that that actually happened. And I also need to flag another thing because nowhere near enough people notice this, which is Zoro's final line to Ryuma as he fades from this world. The sword is mine to keep. But let's pretend this fight never happened, samurai of the Wano country. So essentially, Zoro is claiming that nothing happened, which is a philosophy that he would iconically go on to demonstrate later on during this same arc. But whenever the discussion of iconic Zoro moments comes up, I'm not sure if I've ever heard someone mention the clash with Ryuma. Again, the fight takes place over about a chapter and a half, and I think it's not often remembered as one of Zoro's finest moments because it gets overshadowed by the spectacle and sheer brutality of his other opponents. You know, ones like Zoro versus Kaku, where you got these two guys relentlessly gutting each other, spilling blood everywhere, and doing giraffe things and all that. That is not this fight. And in fact, as I stated before, Zoro doesn't take a single hit during the entire battle. And as for Ryuma, he only takes one hit, the final hit. And so the word that I would use to describe this fight over all other words in the English language would be clean, which is not to be mistaken with Zoro having an easy time. Throughout the short bout, it is reiterated over and over again that Zoro and Zombie Ryuma are completely equal opponents. And you can argue that Zoro was at a disadvantage because he was missing a sword, but I would say that Ryuma had an even greater detriment by not having the memories to use either his body or Brook's techniques to their maximum intent. And even then, right up until the last attack, this was the most even Zoro fight we've ever seen, which is very much the samurai way. The ideal and romanticized method of combat was one-on-one, and there was no exchange of blows, just one clean strike from the superior swordsman that delivered a precise and honorable defeat.